Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by just reminding you where we are. In the earlier lectures, I talked at some length about liberalism and then also said a little about libertarianism. And in the lecture immediately before this, I introduced conservative ideas. But while I hope what I said then was interesting, you may well have wondered, well, just what is the relationship between those older conservative ideas and conservatism today? In order to explain this, I need first of all to say a little more about the history of conservatism. First of all, the ideas that I was talking about last time speak to social circumstances that are in some ways rather different from ours. I mean, as you may have felt, that there was a sense in which the picture that I was conjuring up was a little bit one of landed estates and peasants tucking their forelocks to lords and things of this time. Things have moved on. And indeed, during the 19th century, industrialization took place in Western countries and the political franchise was extended. And as a result, politicians had to actively reinterpret conservative ideas for the new setting that they found themselves in. And actually, they did this in rather different ways. Some of them adopted a kind of state-centered paternalism. That's to say, some conservative politicians tried to attract the support of the working class, for example, by way of supporting state-based schemes of social insurance. Another interesting twist was really this, that as within liberalism, welfare liberal views developed, some conservative politicians made a bid for the support of business, the wealthy, and for the support of what I guess you could call self-improvers, those people who wanted to improve their social position, and as a result appealed to ideas that were a kind of mix between the conservative tradition in the sense in which I was talking about it last time and the classical liberal tradition. To cut really quite a long story short, because there are various other twists and turns, this particular combination became attractive at various different historical periods, and indeed it became particularly attractive again in the light of some problems that governments, taking a somewhat interventionist line in the economy, ran into in the 1970s. And as a result, both in the US with President Reagan and in the UK with Mrs. Thatcher, you had political regimes which combined classical liberal ideas about economic and social policy with, at the same time, a powerful appeal to traditional and patriotic values at home, and also to the perceived threat of the Soviet Union abroad. That period, however, is now also behind us. And I guess that we can now well ask, just what does conservatism mean today? I'll suggest, in fact, that we can usefully look at it as involving four different strands. These will be what I'll call intellectual conservatism, that there will then be what I'll call two different strands of a kind of conservatism of reaction. I'll speak briefly, but not in this main category, of the movement of so-called neoconservatives, and I will also rather contentiously, at the end of the lecture, suggest that in an odd way, some of the ideas of the older conservative tradition can now be found on the left side of politics. But to that we'll get later. Let me start off by saying something about intellectual conservatism today. What do I have in mind here? Well, typically what I'm concerned with are people who have read and been influenced by Burke. People also, say in the US, who have been influenced by the tradition of British conservatism and the kind of things that I was talking about in the last lecture. And also a very significant influence in the US has been the work of the German-born and then American political theorist Leo Strauss, who was based at the University of Chicago, who either personally or through various disciples of his have had quite an impact on conservative intellectuals here. We're dealing here really with a relatively small number of intellectuals, but they've made a considerable impact on the world by way of their involvement in public policy and also by way of their role as advisors to conservative politicians. Oddly, it seems to me, they've had influences of two slightly different kinds, but ones which you can understand by relating them back to the different strands within conservatism that I talked about in the first lecture on conservatism. First of all, there are people whose big concern is really with issues of moral principle. For them, morality is really what matters. They also typically want to stress that there is more to us than just consumers. They are aware of the importance of traditions and habits and specific attitudes in sustaining both social and political life. Their own orientation may be explicitly religious, although sometimes they may just stress morality but without putting it in a religious frame, and they often, though, see themselves as offering a contemporary reinterpretation of timeless values, of bringing these timeless values to bear on the stuff of politics, and in a sense of reminding us, or wanting to remind us, or wanting to claim, that you can't actually run a society if you cast yourself adrift from timeless values. They may at the same time stress human fallibility and the need to safeguard our institutions, and also to safeguard, in a sense, the human characters that are needed to make them work against threats coming from a variety of different directions. In this context, some of these conservatives may be concerned about the impact of commercial activity on people. But I guess more typically you'll get emphasis placed on the bad effects that may come from the activities of government. Not least, for example, in terms of the provision of benefits, and more generally the welfare liberal agenda of granting people autonomy, where this is done without at the same time calling for behavior, which in the view of these conservatives is vital, not only in terms of shaping individuals' lives, but also for the successful working of societies. You get this concern for morality, you get this concern both for the integrity of the individual, the moral integrity of the individual, but also this view that institutions won't work, society won't work unless you have people behaving in the right kind of way, and this concern that government has got away from that, is granting people autonomy without getting them to behave in the appropriate kind of manner. Above all, from this perspective, you have the view that there is no good reason why government should be neutral between virtue and vice, and between what we know it's claimed to be good for individuals and social life on the one side, and what isn't on the other. That's to say, there's an attack here on liberal ideas about government neutrality. The second tendency is really rather different, because some of these intellectual conservatives stress the theme of statescraft and on government as a skill and something that may be developed so that in practical terms it amounts almost to an attachment to so-called realpolitik, namely that those with power should do really whatever is needed to keep things running properly. Those, from that perspective, with political power, have the obligation to keep things running on their proper course, and this means using their practical judgment, using their nous, using their practical skills as statespeople. And it may mean doing things that are not principled in the ordinary sense. And so one gets these two rather different reactions coming out of intellectual conservatism. A second, and I think numerically significant group of conservatives today are people who in various ways react against different features of current society. Sometimes their critics might say, by way of a contrast with a somewhat idealized view of the past. I'm going here to concentrate on two groups with slightly overlapping concerns. First of all, there are, perhaps if you wanted to stereotype them, those who are often living some way away from the main metropolitan centres. And indeed, what strikes them is that as government has followed a welfare liberal agenda, it's led to things taking place which seem to them to threaten their own values and their own preferred ways of life. indeed. If these people are conservative in their social attitudes and religious views, or indeed if they have become attracted to more recent forms of conservative religious belief, they may increasingly feel that their ideals and their ways of life are under threat, and they may resent intensively what they may